This is an NBC News special report. The resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. Here are Matt Lauer and Savannah Guthrie.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Lauer in New York. Savannah Guthrie is at the Vatican, where right now, as you can see by these live images, Pope Benedict XVI is leaving his apartment at the Vatican. He will make his way outdoors to Vatican Square, to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, and he will leave that square for the last time shortly as the leader of the Catholic Church. Savannah?
That's right. We are seeing the waning moments map of the papacy of Benedict XVI, a famously private man. We are now seeing him in his final public moments. He held an emotional meeting this morning with his cardinals, and any moment we expect to see another emotional final farewell, as you mentioned, on the Vatican grounds. We see him departing this morning from the papal residence. He took the elevator down, I'm told, and in a few moments he will come into the courtyard, the San Damaso courtyard. This is the place where every spring the Swiss guards that protect the Pope take their oath. He's showing why, partly, he has decided to take this extraordinary step of abdicating the papacy. He walks a bit slower than he did nearly 8 years ago when he assumed this position. He's had some trouble with his heart, but he's been speaking with great strength and clarity in these final few days of his papacy, and there he is as he walks out to be greeted by senior Vatican officials, members of his staff. He will return one day to the Vatican in a few months, but he will not return as Pope. So let's watch for a moment.
Savannah, members of the Swiss Guard in attendance. You talked about this is where they take their oath, this courtyard. They will guard him until 8 o'clock local time, Rome time this evening, and then they will be replaced by Vatican police. They will no longer be required to guard the head of the Catholic Church. The Pope will get into that car there in the courtyard for a short drive to the helipad there at the Vatican, where he will board one of the Vatican helicopters, a white helicopter, for that short 20-mile or so trip to Castel Gandolfo, where he will take up residence for the next 2 months. And as you mentioned, this is an emotional scene that really reflects the emotions we've seen over the last couple of weeks and the last several hours as the College of Cardinals greeted him this morning. I'm joined here in New York by Father Robert Barron. I know you've got Greg Burke there in Rome with you, along with George Weigel. And Father Barron, since we're watching something unprecedented in the last 600 years or so, let's just start with your emotions.
Yeah, and the emotions are very conflicted. I think I probably speak for a lot of Catholics in saying that we feel a certain sadness about this, a certain trepidation because we're in uncharted waters. We're not quite sure what this will mean for future popes. Also probably a sense of relief for Pope Benedict. You know, he's announced that he just can't go on physically and intellectually with this job, so a certain relief for his sake. But I think Catholics have a lot of mixed emotions. I certainly do as I watch these scenes.
Savannah?
As you mentioned, Matt, we have Greg Burke with us. He's the Vatican Senior Communications Advisor. Mr. Burke, good morning. It's so good to have you with us. I wonder what these last 17 days or so have been like for people like you here in the Vatican, planning for something that was ultimately very unexpected, at least in terms of its exact timing.
Yeah, totally unexpected. I mean, it was an absolute surprise for us. We've tried dealing with it. I was not in the Vatican when this happened 8 years ago when John Paul II died. Many of the things are similar. You've got the sense of uncertainty, but you also have this other thing which is entirely new, which is a Pope who has basically named it. Here's the time, 8 o'clock tonight, it's over.
And to a certain extent, the Pope and his cardinals are writing the rule book as we go along. One of these issues is how much fanfare did the Pope want as he says his goodbye? We saw the final public audience yesterday. He had this emotional meeting with the cardinals this morning. Is this the goodbye that he wanted?
This is the goodbye, definitely. I mean, these are who the people cheering right now are those people in the Secretary of State who work where I do, just 2 floors above where they are, San Damaso. And I think that was very important that they were able to say goodbye, but he didn't want anything huge. He had that at the audience. He's not somebody who likes big celebrations in general, but I think it was only right that the people who worked with him, his collaborators, that they got to give give him a send-off.
And as we watch Matt, he takes this short drive to a helipad belonging to the Vatican atop a hill where he'll get into a white helicopter, and there's a short flight to Castel Gandolfo. It's about 20 miles south of Rome. As you know, it's the papal summer residence, but in the short term, it will be the residence of, starting tonight at 8 o'clock local time, the Pope Emeritus.
Right, and as we wait for him to arrive at the helipad, Savannah, I know you have George Weigel there. I just wonder if George would comment on some of the comments we heard from Pope Benedict XVI as he addressed the College of Cardinals this morning. One jumped out at me, George. Prior to bidding farewell to each of you personally, I want to tell you that I will continue to be close to you in prayer, especially in the next few days, so that you may all be fully docile to the action of the Holy Spirit in the election of a new pope.
Joseph Ratzinger in 2005, Matt, was one of only 2 cardinals who had participated before in a papal election, the 2 elections of 1978. He knows exactly what the burden of responsibility is that these men are taking on themselves. He knows the conflicted emotions that many of them have, some of which Greg and Father Barron have just described. So I think he was saying to them, look, I know how you feel, and I am going to be with you in solidarity and in prayer over the next several weeks of what is going to be a difficult test.
And George, at the same time, he has made clear he does not want to exert undue influence on the process. This is not somebody who's behind the scenes twisting arms saying this should be the next pope.
Absolutely not, Savannah. He is going to disappear. We're not going to see this man for months. He's too much a respecter of the process. He's too much a respecter of his brother cardinals. And he's too, frankly, humble a human being to try to monkey in any way whatsoever with the selection of his successor.
Matt?
Yeah, I was curious, though, and Father Barron, jump in on this as well. As I watched the images of him personally greeting the members of the College of Cardinals, I was wondering, do you get the sense they felt they were seeing him for the last time, or might they visit this Pope Emeritus in the area of the Vatican that he'll be living in? Might the future Pope seek his counsel?
Yeah, you know what's complicated about this to me is it's a bit like George Washington, who set a precedent with every move he made as the first president of the U.S. that we're in these uncharted waters, and so everything this now retired pope does, I guess, will set a certain precedent. So we really don't know. My guess is that for the next several weeks and months, he will, as George said, pretty much disappear, and happily so. He's a scholar, will disappear to his books. Now, down the pike, months, perhaps years, I can see cardinals certainly coming to see him. Would the new pope consult him? I don't know if that would set up too much of a tension and ambiguity. I think we're just watching precedents being set every moment here.
We want to just mention once
and as we watch the...
I'm sorry, Savannah. Once he boards the helicopter, just a sense of the route he may be taking. He'll fly over the Tiber River, perhaps with a view of the Trevi Fountain over Rome's central train station, some of the areas, the neighborhoods surrounding Rome, and then he'll perhaps take the route of the Via Appia, what the Romans called the Queen of the Long Roads. And although there are several other small airports in that area, you would imagine the Pope's helicopter has the right of way for the next 10 minutes or so. Savannah?
No question about that, Matt. And as we are joined here by not only George Weigel, our Vatican analyst, we have got Greg Burke from the Vatican. Reflecting on the papacy of Benedict XVI, he was no John Paul II in the sense that he's not this charismatic extrovert. This was a shy and bookish theologian, somebody who never really embraced the public spotlight. You get to see him from a perspective that we don't.
Yeah, but he got a lot better at it, you know, and when he came, he said he wasn't going to try to be John Paul II, which nobody could. I think it was clear that John Paul was a professor and an actor, and Joseph Ratzinger was just the professor. But I have to admit, he got better at it, and people embraced him for who he was. George was mentioning the humility. I noticed that on his trips, that people saw he didn't have body language, but they saw by his non-body language, you know, this humility. You always sensed he was surprised that all these people had shown up for me. You know, and people grabbed that. They realized that, and I think for that reason they were also willing to listen to him.
And we see now, Matt, of course, the helicopter that will take the Pope to his place of residence for the next couple of months, Castel Gandolfo.
Yeah, and he won't be alone in the helicopter, Father Barron. There are going to be some very close aides flying with him.
Well, of course, Archbishop Georg Genswein, who for many years has been his personal secretary, as a Monsignor was secretary for most of Benedict's papacy, and just in very recent weeks was named an archbishop. And he'll be continuing as prefect of the papal household with the new pope, and also continuing as Pope Benedict's private secretary. So he's been a major player in the life of Pope Benedict.
We should also mention, once he arrives at Castel Gandolfo, he's expected to be greeted by a local parish priest, by the mayor of that city, and as well as many of its residents. I think they're expecting as many as 8,000 people to try to get a glimpse of this Pope, who is not yet the former Pope, but will be in a couple of hours, as he lands at Castel Gandolfo, Savannah.
And as we reflect on who may succeed this Pope, the question is what that means for the Catholic Church writ large. I think, George, you and I were talking earlier, there's a way of looking at this, that you had John Paul, who reigned for 26 years, then you had Benedict, who had been his deputy, essentially, the continuation of this era. But now, with this election of a new Pope, may we see a real change in the Catholic Church?
I don't think so, Savannah. I think the course has been set by the Second Vatican Council, as interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Their relationship and the relationship of these two pontificates was really a seamless one. We all get so caught up in the personalities that we don't sometimes pay attention, as we should, to the continuity, the stretching out of one pontificate into another. I think the course is set into the missionary evangelical Catholicism of the future, and the next Pope will embody that.
And Greg, let's just get practical for a moment. From the spiritual to the mundane, he will continue to wear the white cassock. What else has been arranged for him?
He'll continue to wear the white cassock. Much has been made of the shoes, which changed from red to brown, and other than that, not a whole lot. The fisherman's ring and those kind of things also changed, just as if a pope had died. The fact of the matter is, and I think this is good, he's going to a house that he knows. He's spent every summer there, part of every summer there, and this is important, just I think in terms of easing him into his new house eventually in the convent. He's going to Castel Gandolfo. He's going to be very much at home. And really probably more relieved than he was when he used to go there during the summer. You know, more than ever, a time where he's able to read and pray, which is what he wants to do. Been very impressive talking to the cardinals today. The humility, talking, I will be praying for you as you make this important decision.
And as we watch these historic scenes and listen as bells are chiming across Rome, we saw them a few moments ago on the screen. We hear them here in Rome as we stand next to St. Peter's Square. The Pope, a modern Pope, even at his 86 years old, has tweeted. He wrote, "Thank you for your love and support. May you always experience the joy that comes from putting Christ at the center of your lives." Maybe not the final word, but some of the final words, Matt, from Pope Benedict XVI.
And you say a modern Pope, that's right. He did embrace Twitter, although maybe more a toe in the water than a full-fledged endorsement of it. I think that may be his 39th or 40th tweet ever. Again, we don't know if he'll tweet again before 8 o'clock this evening. Getting back to Castel Gandolfo for a second, Savannah, he did have some things to say about that place. As a matter of fact, a plaque outside the city hall there quotes the Pope's 2011 endorsement. He says, quote, "Here I find everything, mountains, a lake, and I can even see the sea, and of course good people." The Pope's helicopter now lifting off from the Vatican for that short trip to what will be his home for the next 2 months. And I would imagine as this clears the walls and can now come into view of people, some several hundred, perhaps 1,000 who've gathered in St. Peter's Square watching this on a large monitor, it will be very emotional for them to watch this helicopter fly by.
It's amazing to watch, and Matt, I can tell you I have a view of it right now as it crosses the setting sun here in Rome, and one can only imagine what is going through the mind of Pope Benedict XVI as he surveys this ancient and historic city, leaving it as Pope for the last time. And he was ordained in 1951, was a scholar, a theologian, a long-time official here at the Vatican, elevated to Pope nearly 8 years ago. and now going down in history for a host of reasons, not the least of which is the rarity of the circumstances that he has abdicated, something not done in more than nearly 6 centuries.
That's right. People in Rome and at the Vatican are not used to seeing what we are watching right now. This is really more akin to what we're used to in this country as a president leaves office and gets in Marine One and flies off from the South Lawn of the White House as the new president is inaugurated. This is not something that the Vatican and the Catholic Church is used to, Father.
Yeah, and if I could speak to that, I think that's a fear perhaps that some of us have, if this sets a precedent, that it doesn't overly politicize the office. It was so integral to the papacy that it was a lifelong ministry, a lifelong commitment. I certainly understand Pope Benedict's decision, but at the same time, I share a certain wariness about that, lest it become simply a politicized office and we expect the Pope to resign.
Do you worry, as I read in some publications, that perhaps in the future, because of the precedent set by this resignation, that when future popes or people disagree with future popes, they might exert pressure on them to also resign?
Right, and that's what I mean by the politicization of it. I do worry about that. Again, fully understanding what Pope Benedict did, it's fully in line with the canon law of the Church. At the same time, I think it's your reference to the president leaving the White House speaks to that fear of an overly politicized papacy.
As we watch, and we're seeing images now coming from another Vatican helicopter that is now flying behind the helicopter carrying Pope Benedict. Yes, Savannah.
I have to tell you, the helicopter just passed by our live shot close enough, as it were, to wave as he leaves Rome, and we all take in this historic moment. There are, it would appear to be, thousands of people in St. Peter's Square who came to watch this on a big screen monitor. They're able to view it as well. It's a short flight, as you mentioned, to Castel Gandolfo, and to continue the conversation that you've been having with Father Barron in New York, it's this issue, George Weigel, of what happens now, because as a practical matter, we will have a new pope and emeritus pope living side by side, sharing a personal secretary. Will that be awkward?
No, well, they certainly are not going to share a personal secretary. Archbishop Gainswein is not going to be the new Pope's secretary. There are not going to be 2 popes. There will be no pope as of 8 o'clock tonight, and there will be a pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Roman pontiff, once the College of Cardinals elects a man and he accepts. At that point, there will not be 2 popes. There will be 1 pope, 1 Roman pontiff, 1 source of authority in the Church. I just wanted to say one thing while we're watching these remarkable helicopter shots. The Romans took to this man from the beginning. I remember 8 years ago walking through the Borgo neighborhood, just a few blocks from here, where Cardinal Ratzinger lived. And everybody there wanted the neighbor to get elected.
And let me just pause for a moment so we could acknowledge that it just flew over the ancient ruins of the Colosseum, getting quite a view on his way out of town. You were saying?
It says something good about the Catholic people of Rome, that having dominated this office for 455 years, they have embraced in a remarkably warm way a Pole and a German. And whether the next pope comes from Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, or North America, I think they'll embrace him as well.
Matt?
Savannah, you know, we mentioned maybe 1,000 or a couple of thousand people in St. Peter's Square watching this unfold on big monitors. Imagine how many people in Rome right now have pulled their cars off to the side of the road and are craning their necks to get a glimpse of this, or sitting in their apartments or office places looking out the window as this helicopter passes slowly overhead in no hurry whatsoever. You mentioned the scenery that it's passing. We've got Claudio Lavanga, who's NBC's bureau chief in Rome. He is waiting at Castel Gandolfo, and I would imagine there's great anticipation there, Claudio.
Mark, there's great anticipation here in the main square of Castel Gandolfo. Well, thousands of people are climbing up the small square here in the town. About 8,000 people, we were told. They came here about a couple of hours ago. They've joined in prayers. There were a couple of rounds of applause here. First, when the loudspeaker said that the Pope was leaving the Apostolic Palace, and secondly, when the local church bells started ringing. Well, the helicopter ride is about 10 minutes from Vatican City to here, so we expect to see, or hear at least, that helicopter to arrive down here in about 5 minutes. The helipad here is about 1 mile away from the summer residence, whose entrance you can see just behind me. Well, people are just waiting for him to take the little drive, 5 minutes drive, into the residence from the back, and then he's going to appear on that small balcony that you see above me. The curtains are open, microphone is on and tested. Well, there's no script there. The Vatican said that he's just going to improvise, but the expectation is that he will just want to thank everybody here and around the world for their support and for the understanding of that difficult decision that he had to take for the decision for the good of the church. Well, finally at 8 o'clock to 9 p.m., well, that is 2 p.m. East Coast time, well, he will cease to be the pontiff. All the executive powers of the Catholic Church will stop. And also the symbolic moment that everybody is expecting is that the Swiss guards, the guards that for the 500 years are known to be protecting the Pope, will walk out of that door, signifying that there is no more Pope to protect until a new one is elected, of course. Matt?
All right. Claudio, thank you very much. We're still monitoring the scene from a helicopter that is following the Pope's helicopter as it makes its way from Vatican City to Castel Gandolfo, where Claudio was just reporting from. And there is no formal ceremony at 8 o'clock tonight. There is no ceremony other than what Claudio just mentioned. Those Swiss guards will leave, the door will close, and he will be Pope no longer.
Again, we're just seeing it all for the first time, and the precedent's being set. What strikes me in watching these extraordinary pictures is the Pope passing over this incomparably important city of Rome and passing over the Colosseum where Christians are persecuted and all of the historical resonances. And now this added to it. We're watching a moment of tremendous novelty and historical importance.
And by the way, this Pope, Pope Benedict, will learn of the announcement of the new Pope in the same way everybody else will. He will hear the announcement and watch what happens on the balcony as the new Pope is named. He won't get tipped off early or anything like that. Just a couple of minutes now before this helicopter touches down at Castel Gandolfo.
I was very struck, you mentioned the first tweet, or that last tweet of the Pope mentioning Christ. You know, in Christocentrism, that Christ is the very center of life, is central to the teaching of Joseph Ratzinger over many, many decades, and very much in his papal teaching. I heard it many times in papal audiences, and always the joy that comes from making Christ the center. That's the dominant theme of his teaching.
As we continue to watch and wait for our next glimpse of Pope Benedict XVI, some stations will be going to local programming right now. Others will stay with us for more coverage right here on NBC. And we are back now with coverage of the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. You're looking at the Vatican helicopter that carries the Pope making its way to Castel Gandolfo. I'm Matt Lauer in New York, along with Father Robert Barron. Savannah Guthrie is in Vatican City, along with Greg Burke and George Weigel. Savannah, back to you.
Matt, as we stand here, we are all struck by the moment, the fact that this Pope has departed in such an unusual way. I want to bring in Greg Burke, who, as you mentioned, is the Vatican Senior Communications Advisor. And as we wish a farewell to Pope Benedict XVI, inevitably, the Church's leaders are thinking about who may replace him. Let's talk some mechanics here. As we have learned in the last few days, a conclave is the method by which a new Pope is selected. We haven't yet gotten a date for the conclave. There's some work to do first with the full congregation of cardinals, 208 of them. Tell us about that.
That's right. You've got the cardinals will be convoked officially as of tomorrow. Cardinal Sodano, who's the dean of the cardinals, will send out the letter officially convoking them. Of course, everybody has known for more than 2 weeks what's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, from the count, it doesn't look like all of them were in as of today. They will be called and to meet on Monday, at which point there's been much talk about whether or not the actual conclave, the voting, can be moved up. It has to start within 15 days of the vacancy, which begins tonight. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not it can be moved up. If it is, all the cardinals have to decide that. But they will get down to work as of Monday, at least, in starting those mechanics and starting those discussions.
And to be a fly in the wall in those discussions, particularly when the conclave, which is the elector cardinals, when they convene to actually go about the business of selecting a next pope. What do we know, George, about how this process unfolds? It's so mysterious, it's so secretive. They will actually stay inside a Vatican guest house, almost like a sequestered jury. And by the way, this guest house was swept today for any listening or communications devices. This is serious business.
I was thinking earlier today, Savannah, it's as secretive as backdoor politics in Chicago in the 1930s. Here's a story from inside a conclave told to me by Pope Benedict XVI when he was Cardinal Ratzinger. I asked him when he had had his first serious conversation with Karol Wojtyła, the man who would be elected John Paul II. And he said it was during the first conclave of 1978, after the death of Pope Paul VI, and they took a walk together around that Cortile San Damaso that we just saw and discussed the state of the church around the world and found each other of one mind about this. So one of the things that happened in that conclave is that the Wojtyła-Ratzinger partnership, the John Paul II Ratzinger partnership, was formed during a nighttime walk around that courtyard from which Pope Benedict XVI just departed. I wonder if that was on his mind at that point.
An interesting partnership that unfolded over the decades and now ends here with a flight from Rome to Castel Gandolfo under these extraordinary and historic circumstances, Matt.
Yeah, getting back to the conclave for a second, I'd love to hear George comment on this. You know, I'm reading an article right now where Cardinal Franz Koenig was interviewed. He passed away back in the about 2004, but he was asked about participating in conclaves in 1963 and 1978 and about the drama inside the room and the intrigue and the emotion. And what he said, George, was actually if you could watch what happens inside, you'd be bored to tears. That apparently there isn't quite the drama that a lot of people think there would be.
Well, the balloting process itself, Matt, is a rather formal, some might say Baroque and slow one. But let me tell you a story that Cardinal Koenig told me when I was preparing my biography of John Paul II. He said in the second conclave of 1978, when the two principal Italian electors had deadlocked, Koenig went to see one night in the Apostolic Palace, where they were all living in jury-rigged apartments in those days, went to see his old friend, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, the primate of Poland, and said to him, does Poland have a candidate to present? And Cardinal Wyszynski said, Ma, you don't think I should be Pope, do you? That would be a terrible victory for the communists if I were to leave Poland. And Koenig said, but there is another, which was the man he had in mind all along, the younger man, Wojtyła.
Father Barron?
Yeah, I've heard from a cardinal who was involved in the 2005 conclave that the conclave itself is more like a liturgical event. It's very quiet, it's very solemn. You know, as the electors come up and they take that oath before Michelangelo's Last Judgment, the oath that Christ be their witness, it's a very formal, serious setting. And then I was struck too, this morning my boss in Chicago, Cardinal George, was quoted as saying, maybe you've seen us cardinals talking at these various events. Well, we're not just talking about the weather. You know, they're starting already this process of, you know, assessing the state of the church, looking at possible candidates. So some of that's going on as we speak.
And what role does experience play, Father Barron? I mean, back in 2005, it's my understanding only 2 of the members of the College of Cardinals had been through a conclave before. Now that number is 50. Yeah. So they've been through it. They know the procedure. How might that affect their deliberations?
Yeah, I don't know how much it would affect it. They'll be more comfortable, obviously, in this setting. They'll know what to expect. I'm not sure it'll affect the voting all that profoundly, but you're right. There's a far greater number who have had some conclave experience. I'm just fascinated by that process, and I do think a lot of the cardinal electors will be looking around the wider church. As the church grows, you know, in South America, Africa, parts of Asia, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they start looking around to candidates from those parts of the world.
Savannah?
Well, we are watching this helicopter and seeing that the landing gear appears to be down. Let's bring in Claudio Lavanga. He's our Rome bureau chief, but we have him posted at Castel Gandolfo this morning. Claudio, is the crowd growing there?
Well, Savannah, the crowd is quite a scene here. I mean, there's thousands of people with their heads tilted upwards. They're all trying to catch a glimpse of this helicopter, well, including us, of course, but it looks like he's taken a route from the back. Well, we didn't see it, but also this is a very small medieval square that is covered by very tall medieval buildings. So that may be the reason why we haven't seen it, but people are being told by loudspeakers what's going on, and they started to reciting prayers again. So to get a glimpse of the Pope himself, they'll have to wait for another 15 to 30 minutes when he will be greeted at the heliport by a small delegation led by Cardinal Bertello. Then he will take a small drive here and appear on that balcony just above me, where he will address this crowd that is so eagerly awaiting for him. Savannah?
And Claudio, as he descends, we're getting a glimpse of that gorgeous Italian countryside, which makes this such an appealing Italian retreat, and one that the Pope is said to love quite a bit. As we continue our discussion here with Greg Burke, George Weigel, the question is raised. Pope Benedict was somebody whose scholarly credentials were unmatched. He was said to have a searing intellect, but in truth, many people considered him to be a weak manager. Is this an occasion where they'll be looking for someone not only who has those spiritual credentials, but somebody who can run this massive institution? I think I read one article that said maybe it's time for an MBA Pope.
Savannah, I think the first order of business is to find a man who can be what one of the Pope's titles is, the universal pastor of the church. A man with pastoral experience, evangelical experience, missionary experience. He can then find a strong Cardinal Secretary of State to ride herd on the bureaucracy for him and to reform it, as many hope will be done in the next pontificate.
We're seeing the chopper door open, and we do expect at any moment to see Benedict XVI emerge after a short but scenic flight from Rome to Castel Gandolfo, about 20 miles away from Rome. I'll bring in Greg Burke, the Vatican advisor. A question arises at 8 o'clock tonight local time. The papacy officially ends, and we enter into a period of the sede vacante, the vacant seat. There is no pope. They call it the interregnum. Let's get practical. Who runs the church during this time?
Who runs the church? The Camerlengo, who in this case is the Secretary of State, very well known, Tarcisio Bertone, and of course he has been at the helm, so he does know how things run. It's only ordinary business, though, of course. I mean, precisely, the rules are precise here, and they are known. We may be on uncharted territory on other things with an abdication, but in terms of what happens in a sede vacante, which starts at 8 o'clock tonight, that's very clear. It's simply ordinary business in getting the conclave started. You can't start naming bishops and making reforms of the church or anything like that.
Savannah, it's also worth noting that at 8 o'clock tonight, with one or two exceptions, every senior official in the Vatican loses his job. Bertone will be the Camerlengo. He will not be the Secretary of State. The heads of the Vatican congregations will lose their jobs. The heads of the pontifical councils will lose their jobs. The machinery will be kept ticking over by the third-ranking official in each of these congregations. But everybody's out of a job as of 8 o'clock tonight, so the new pope can start afresh.
As a practical matter, how much change do popes typically do? I mean, do they reappoint some of these same people?
It depends on the pope. Some do and some don't. Benedict XVI re-upped everyone right away. I rather doubt that's going to happen this time around.
And as we watch these moments with the Pope on the helipad in Castel Gandolfo, meeting with some local officials in anticipation of one final glimpse of him from the balcony of Castel Gandolfo, where the masses have already gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse. Matt, we'll send it back to you as we watch these historic moments.
All right, Savannah, let's talk a little bit more about timing, Father Barron. I mean, we know that the cardinals will meet in the general congregation starting on Monday, and that's really a series of discussions. They'll talk about the future of the church, the issues facing the church, and in some way, do those discussions point us in the direction of a front runner? In other words, if there is one key issue and there is one candidate who is best versed in that issue, does that person naturally become a front runner?
Well, it can happen. I think last time around, Joseph Ratzinger was so impressive as he led many of these congregations. I spoke to a number of cardinals who said just that. They got to Rome, they saw him leading these with such intelligence and such creativity and with such command of language that he emerged as kind of a front runner. I think what they'll do, they'll ask various cardinals to assess the situation of the church in their part of the world. And in that process, they're going to see the intelligence, linguistic skill, and perceptiveness of various cardinals. And so I think that's when it happens.
There are a couple of guys being talked about, and in the article I'm reading now, they're called, in quotes, big dogs, and I don't mean that with any lack of respect, but we're talking about Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the dean, but of course he is 85 years old, which probably makes it very unlikely that he would be named the next post.
Candidate for next post.
And George just mentioned Cardinal Bertone, and he is someone who probably doesn't have as good a chance as he might otherwise have, because he has been faulted by some as being perhaps to blame for some of the managerial problems that this Pope has had over the last 8 years.
Quite right. I think certainly his age, too. I think he's 78 years old. I'd be very surprised if the Cardinals elected someone much, let's say, beyond the early 70s, given the fact that this man was elected at 78 and now is retiring, for old age. So I'd be very surprised at that. And also, as you say, Bertone was a very controversial figure and not the one they'd probably turn to clean up the situation in the Curia.
Let's talk about geography, okay? Because obviously there are 115 cardinals who will be voting. Let's break it down. Europe, of the voting cardinals, had 60 of them. Mm-hmm. North America, 17. South America, 13. 11 in Africa, 10 from Asia. Central America, 3. And so when you look at those numbers, and keeping in mind that 8 of the last 10 popes have come from Italy, do you start to see some trends developing that are hard to break?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Europe is probably overrepresented among the College of Cardinals, given the fact the church is struggling in Western Europe. The numbers are growing. I'll give you an example. There's only one cardinal in the Philippines, yet there are some 68 million Catholics in the Philippines. Only 3 cardinals in Mexico, and that's the second largest Catholic country in the world. So Europe is certainly overrepresented in that sense. So we'll see.
I just want to say, before I throw it back to Savannah, you get a sense for just the beauty of Castel Gandolfo here as we watch the Pope's motorcade make its way from the helipad to the actual palace, and the stunning grounds and gardens that surround this place. I believe that might be the palace in the background there. But I mean, this is a summer retreat. It was designated that to avoid the stiflingly hot summers that Rome is notorious for. This is a bit of a hill, an area where there is a breeze, which is welcome during the months of June, July, and August. And again, just scenically breathtaking.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Savannah?
A peaceful place to spend a few months, as this emeritus Pope will, before he moves into more permanent headquarters here at the Vatican, not far from the papal residence, in fact. And as we talk about the future of the church, I'm sure there are a lot of Americans wondering what direction doctrinally the church might take under a new Pope, considering these cardinal electors were all appointed by either John Paul II or Benedict XVI, 2 very conservative popes. George Weigel, my guess is you're going to say we are not going to see a sea change in terms of doctrine or theology.
Well, it's not so much because of who appointed whom, Savannah, as it is because of the fact that changing popes is not like changing a governor or changing a president in the United States. The church has, if you will, a constitution, in the British sense of constitution, not American. The church has settled teachings, and those are not susceptible to amendment by a pope. The pope is the servant of the church's tradition, not the master of it. Now, popes can interpret that tradition, popes can stretch it. John Paul II certainly stretched the church's teaching on human rights, for example, putting religious freedom at the center of any rational scheme of human rights. But in terms of the so-called hot-button issues, it's simply not susceptible to change.
Well, we are watching, of course, as the Pope gets out of the car, arriving Castel Gandolfo, and we will see him in a few moments. A final glimpse of him as Pope from the balcony. Greg Burke is with me, the Vatican Communications Advisor.
Yeah, he's in the inner courtyard right now of the Castel Gandolfo, of the actual palace. So the people outside, I can't see him right now, but you'll see him go up. There's an elevator right behind that door. He'll go up 1 floor. And then out on the balcony. So within 2 or 3 minutes, we'll see him at the balcony.
We've been talking a lot this morning about the future, as is understandable, but he is the man of the moment. So let's tarry there for a minute. And Greg, you have a vantage point that not everyone has. What kind of person was Benedict XVI? What is his reputation among the cardinals, among staff members such as yourselves who work inside these walls?
Among staff members, and I think cardinals, it's the same. It's a gentle man, a humble man, and a wonderful scholar, and somebody who's often done things he really didn't want to do, but he did them because he felt they were the will of God. Coming to Rome in the first place because of the friendship with John Paul II. He wasn't thrilled at the idea. He was a German professor, and he liked being a German professor. He was called in to do that, asked several times to go home. John Paul wanted him here and kept him here till the very end. He finally thought he could go home, and then, of course, was elected Pope.
All right. Matt, we watch as the town square waits a glimpse of Pope Benedict.
Yeah, I think it would be a good time to go back to Claudio Lavanga, who is there in Castel Gandolfo. And Claudio, just give me a sense of the emotion you're seeing.
Well, Matt, you can see it behind me. There was thousands of people waving their flags. The news broke that the Pope has finally arrived and is going to appear on that balcony shortly now. But I spoke to a number of these residents throughout the day today, and what they were saying is that the Pope is coming home. Well, loads of popes, of course, in the past centuries have used this summer as their summer residence to find solace during the sizzling Roman summers. But this Pope in particular, Pope Benedict XVI, loved this place because this is where he could get away from the prying eyes. Well, when he appears on that balcony, he's going to deliver that short speech and then disappear from the side of the square here, but also from the public eye as a whole. Matt.
Just a beautiful setting. I was just looking down at that image of the square just below the balcony, and I saw one souvenir store. They're going to be doing a brisk business, I would imagine, for the next couple of months, Claudio. And by the way, we want to mention, Savannah mentioned that the Pope will be speaking off the cuff in front of the microphone on that balcony. We will have a translator standing by, so you'll be able to understand exactly what Pope Benedict XVI is saying to the faithful down in that square. Can Claudio, I can't make out what they're saying there. What is that?
Well, they're just chanting Benedetto, Benedetto. They're just singing Benedict, Benedict. Well, of course, they know that he's going to appear on that balcony anytime soon. But as you were saying, of course, brisk business from tourist shop here, but brisk business from the restaurants and bars as well, that they have named as well their paninis and pizzas with Benedetto or Benedetto XVI or Ratzinger or Pope. I mean, this town lives and breathes the Pope, and this Pope will be the special guest in the next 2 months. But as they said, he's just coming home, Matt.
And Greg Burke over in Rome, any idea what the Pope will have planned for after 8 o'clock tonight when he becomes Pope Emeritus? How might he spend his first evening in that new role?
I think in total relief, Matt, the reading and prayer. He normally has dinner around 7:30, watches the news at 8. I'll be curious to see whether he watches the news, because obviously he's going to be the lead story. But that's the normal procedure. And then reading and prayer and what he's wanted to do for a long time, he finally gets to do as of 8 o'clock tonight.
And Greg, as we watch these images of the Pope these last couple of days, one can't be helped but be struck by what a frail figure he cuts these days. We've seen him walking with a cane. Just learned in the last few weeks, I believe, that he has a pacemaker, that the battery had to be replaced recently, which I understand was routine. But what can you tell us about how he's feeling these days physically?
Well, physically, I think we've all seen in the past few months there has been a slowdown. Definitely at Christmas, those festivities, there were a lot of different long liturgical celebrations, Christmas Eve Mass, also on the 6th of January, he ordained a number of bishops, long things, and you could tell that they were tiring for him. There was no doubt about that. A difficulty negotiating steps and that kind of thing. I think in his mind, you can see, is great from when he speaks off the cuff, and he did for a long time during this period since announcing it. Spoke for 40 minutes to Roman priests. His mind is clearly perfectly there, but the body is slowing down quite a bit.
Greg, you're a former reporter. Have you been able to do any reporting these last few weeks about when Benedict really started thinking about seriously abdicating, really seriously thinking about it? I know he had mentioned it in passing in a book interview a few years ago, but when he really started thinking about actually doing it?
He mentioned it in the book a couple of years ago, and it was quite clear, and it stood out, I think, to several people, although being a traditionalist, nobody thought he was going to break with almost 6 centuries of tradition. However, his chief of staff did tell me that the trip to Mexico and Cuba, which was almost a year ago, it was a long trip, I was on the trip, was one that really tired the Pope out, and that he began thinking shortly after that, making this decision.
And you can help us locate ourselves within the walls of Castel Gandolfo and about to come to the balcony and address the people.
We're on the first floor, or the same floor as his bedroom, which has a nice view of the lake outside.
And let's listen.
Cari amici,
dear friends,
sono felice di essere con voi, circondato dalla bellezza del creato e dalla vostra simpatia che mi fa molto bene. Grazie per la vostra amicizia, il vostro
friendship.
affetto.
Thank you very much.
Voi sapete che questo giorno mio è diverso da quelli precedenti.
Day brings me
Non sono
great
più
joy.
pontefice sommo della Chiesa Cattolica, fino alle 8 di sera sono ancora, poi non più.
God.
Sono semplicemente un pellegrino.
I'm just a pilgrim
tappa del suo pellegrinaggio in questa terra.
in this pilgrimage on
Vorrei
earth.
ancora
I would also I would
col
also,
mio cuore, col mio
with my
amore,
heart,
con la mia preghiera,
with my
con
prayer,
la mia riflessione, con
with
tutte le
my
mie forze interiori,
reflection, with all my internal power to serve God. And I feel very fortunate. Let's keep going forward. Thank you. My heartfelt thanks.
di tutto il cuore la mia benedizione.
With my entire heart, my blessing. I impart my blessing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, everybody.
Addressing supporters and the faithful down in the square at Castel Gandolfo, who have waited probably more than an hour or two to see him at his new retreat for the next couple of months. Simple words coming from a man who has had a very long and storied and complicated journey over the last several decades, and certainly the last 8 years, Father Barron, as the Pope. And what struck you?
What struck me was he's the Papa. You know, people say "Vive il Papa," long live the Pope, and Pope is just a term derived from Papa, Father. You know, the Church is not an organization; it's a family, and he's our Holy Father. So, just that wonderful, deeply emotional, deeply spiritual connection between him and the people. It's really the beautiful display of the fatherhood of the Pope.
What about the power of the fact that if he is a man of his word, and we certainly know him to be, that is the last we will see of him for a very long time, perhaps ever?
Maybe. I think certainly for a very long time. I think he will want to disappear, again, for personal reasons, but also he doesn't want any conflict between him and the new Pope, or any ambiguity about who is Pope, as George is pointing out so clearly. So I think very happily and with purpose he will disappear.
Savannah?
Well, I'm joined here by Greg Burke and George Weigel, our Vatican analyst. I would love to get your take on a very short, and I think in his trademark humility, a speech in which he says, I am just a pilgrim. But what a pilgrim and what a life he has had in the church, George.
Savannah, I was struck and indeed moved in watching that just a moment ago by how much of the mileage of that pilgrimage you can see on this man's face. He has really poured himself out for the church's Lord, and you can see that in him. And that is something that I think commands respect. It certainly commands the love and affection of those crowds and of Catholics around the world. The pilgrimage has not been a simple or easy one, and he's showing the effects of it.
In the few moments we have, Greg Burke, your thoughts as you watch these scenes?
Very, very similar to what George is saying here. I feel something like sort of St. Paul, I have run the race, you know, and you get very much the sense of that he run the race or carried the cross. I think the timing of the Pope's decision is also interesting now in Lent and probably a new Pope by the time of Holy Week. Very symbolic in the sense that he has carried the cross up till where he can. He says, I'm not abandoning it, I'll still be here to pray, but obviously it's someone else's job now to pick up the cross.
Well, for those of us who've been watching with us this morning, we are witnessing history, a privilege. You see a view of a beautiful Castel Gandolfo. This is the place where Pope Benedict XVI will spend the next couple of months, but he will be Pope for not much longer, just a couple more hours before the papacy officially ends, and a period of sede vacante, a vacancy here at the Vatican, is underway. We want to give our thanks to Greg Burke, George Weigel, Father Robert Barron for helping us this morning. We're going to have more live coverage of the Pope's resignation throughout the day. For now, I'm Savannah Guthrie reporting from Rome.
Grazie per la vostra amicizia, il vostro affetto.